Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Heather Leslie, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's Mitchell Center seminar on behalf of the Mitchell Center. I'm a faculty fellow with the center and coming to you today from the Darling Marine Center, our University of Maine campus in Walpole. So without further ado, I want to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Jocelyn Runnebaum is joining us today. She is the Marine Program Manager at the Nature Conservancy in Maine, and before she came to TNC, Jocelyn worked for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game as a fisheries biologist. She also did her graduate work, her PhD in marine biology at the University of Maine. So we're fortunate to be able to call her an alumna of the institution. And she has experience internationally with the Peace Corps, working in Zambia, as well as in other geographies. And I've had the good fortune to work with Jocelyn the last several years in my role as a trustee at the Nature Conservancy in Maine, and have followed her work for much longer than that with great admiration. And so it's really an honor and delight to welcome her to the seminar series today. Welcome, Jocelyn.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Heather, for that introduction. And thank you so much for the invitation to be here today and talk to folks at the Mitchell Center in the School of Marine Sciences. I just want to first say I really wish I could be there in person today, but also really appreciate the flexibility to join remotely to navigate family logistics. So Heather mentioned, I am the Marine Program Manager at TNC, and I work at the intersection of science, policy, and management on marine resource issues here in Maine. So I've been with TNC for almost 6 years now, and I just wanted to share with you some of the aspects of the work that I've been doing. So for today's talk, I'll give you a brief introduction to the Nature Conservancy and highlight why I think stakeholder engagement is really critical in natural resources management. I also want to touch on how it is that we as an organization decide to do the work that we do. And then I'll step through a discrete example of how we worked on offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. And then I want to step through some work that I'm currently doing on identifying on-ramps for climate, ecosystem, and local knowledge in fisheries management here in New England. So then, of course, I'll wrap up with some conclusions and hopefully leave enough time for discussion, where I'm really hoping we can dig into the fisheries example because of all the expertise that exists at the University of Maine on that topic. So before we get started, I want to ask everyone to have your phones handy. I have a few audience questions throughout the presentation. So you'll be able to scan the QR code on the screen in order to be able to participate. So they'll come up, there's about 3 of them. So keep your phones handy. So let's dig in. As Heather mentioned, most of my background that I wanted to share with you today, I first became interested in working at the intersection of science and policy while I was in the Peace Corps in Zambia. I was working with rural fish farmers at the time, and I had several conversations with federal managers at the Zambia Department of Fisheries, and often left those conversations feeling like there was a disconnect between policy initiatives, the on-the-ground realities, and the science that could support decision-making. So following that experience, I realized I wanted to pursue a graduate degree that focused on integrating science, policy, and management. And the University of Maine was really the only program I found in the US that offered just that. The dual degree program in the School of Marine Sciences really bridges that science to management through the master's program. And I see that Yongchen is on today, and he was my grad school advisor, and I was really fortunate to be in his lab during my time at the University of Maine. So I eventually transitioned all of that work all of my graduate work into a PhD program. But the ethos of centering the connection between science and policy and on the ground realities also held really firm in my PhD and in the work that I do today. So as Heather mentioned, I also worked at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game after I graduated, and I supported the state seat to federal fisheries management. And that's really where I became super familiar with the federal fisheries management process that I'll talk about in a little bit. So I've now been with the Nature Conservancy for almost 6 years. We are a global environmental organization, and we're dedicated to conserving the lands and waters on which all life depends. We work in all 50 states and approximately 80 countries. And here in Maine, we take action to protect land, restore waterways, work toward a healthy and sustainable ocean, and address and mitigate the effects of climate change, as well as hoping to connect people and nature throughout the state. So one of the things that really has struck me at working at TNC is the commitment to robust public processes in order to bring many voices to the table for decision making, particularly around natural resources. So I've often found myself wondering what role it is that we can play in supporting robust public process for durable management decisions. So that's the idea I want to explore with you today. I'll step through two different management processes that pertain to the Gulf of Maine that I personally have been participating in over the past few years. And then, of course, I'm hoping for a wonderful discussion at the end of this. Okay, so why engagement is critical in natural resource management? So just for a brief history, Rachel Carson, who is one of the original founders of TNC Maine, brought a lot of attention to the impacts that humans can have on the environment, and in turn, how environmental degradation can negatively impact us. Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring in 1962, and that sparked the contemporary environmental movement that we know today. And it led to many nationwide actions designed to protect both people and nature. So one such action and a really monumental outcome from this period was the National Environmental Policy Act. This was signed into law on January 1st, 1970, by President Richard Nixon. And NEPA, as it's known, obligates the federal agencies to consider every significant aspect of environmental impact of an action before proceeding with a decision. So the NEPA process is designed to be grounded in science and requires broad public engagement. And over time, it has become one of the primary mechanisms through which the public is able to participate in federal decision making. There's also a broad consensus in the natural resources literature, natural resource management literature, with global evidence that public participation can improve outcomes. I was digging into this literature a little bit, and it seems really clear that there are still opportunities for improvement to how public participation can occur in natural resources. So from my personal experience, and it seems the literature would agree, simply creating opportunities for public participation is not enough. It's important to create meaningful process and opportunities for that engagement to be authentic. And I think that this quote sums it up quite nicely from Reed in 2008. The quality of a decision is strongly dependent on the quality of the process that leads to it. All right, so now is the time you get to take out your phones and scan your QR code. I just want to start with getting a sense of how familiar folks are with some of the public processes that I'm talking about. So please feel free to participate. I see that many folks do participate in public processes and others don't, and that's really helpful. I'm hoping we can explore that a little bit. I also asked you a binary question. So I imagine the true answer for many of you is that it depends. It depends on Engagement depends on if the issue is important to you. It depends on if you have the energy and the attention span to be able to participate. And so I know it depends on many different things to actually engage in these public processes. And the same is true for organizations. So as we move to this next section, I want to highlight the needs for focused engagement in natural resource management processes. So a really important lesson that I've learned during my time at TNC is that it is really impossible to focus on everything all at once. And I think this quote nicely sums it up. If everything is important, then nothing is important. So at TNC and many other conservation organizations, we go through conservation planning to choose where to put our focus and attention, and we develop, over time, we develop clarity for ourselves so that we can take action to have meaningful impact. And the process we use is conservation planning. It can be very comprehensive in order to understand who is doing what in a given space. It's important to identify what gaps exist and what we are posed to uniquely address. So this is one approach to conservation planning that I have here on this slide. There are many, many ways, but this is the one that TNC has been using of late. And you can see that there are several different steps, or we call them modules, to work through these processes. So the Ocean and Coastal Program at TNC Maine undertook an 18-month planning process following pretty much what you saw on that last slide. And we really started with articulating our vision, and that is to advance healthy and resilient ocean and coastal ecosystems in the Gulf of Maine. And we want to see resilient and productive ecosystems that can bounce back from a shock. So we've identified 3 objectives. One is restore and sustain abundance and diversity of species in the Gulf of Maine. The second is to protect, manage, and restore connected and functioning habitats. And the third is to support climate resilience in coastal communities. So we really believe that biodiversity and connected and functioning habitats will support the resilience of communities, as well as we want to support communities to be able to adapt to climate change, to have cultural connection and access to ecosystems, and to be able to contribute to the science, governance, and decision-making around those ecosystems. So the 2 case studies that I'm going to discuss today are couched within our conservation plan for offshore wind and climate-ready fisheries. So for this first case study, I want to show, I next want to share how we approached participating in the Gulf of Maine offshore wind siting process. I do first want to recognize that the Gulf of Maine offshore wind process was challenging for many people here in Maine. And my aim today is to use the offshore wind siting process as a discrete example to demonstrate how we engaged and to highlight some of the lessons that I learned from this process. So wind siting, offshore wind, there are many interests that were considered and are considered, and a modeling process was used to balance these interests. So this figure here shows the variety of interests that were included in the overall decision support tool or the model. That included fisheries, natural and cultural resources, industry and operations, the actual wind resource, and then the red constraints were absolute no-go zones based pretty much on federal authority from different agencies. So the modeling process was really quite complex. because so many different data sets were included and so many different perspectives needed to be incorporated. There were a spectrum of participants that brought a variety of ideas and data sets that were really focused on the issues of importance and relevance to them. And I was just really amazed by the significant amount of expertise that came forward during the process from all of the different interests that were depicted here. So through conversations and public comments, I learned a lot about what everybody's interests were and what was important to other folks, and that was really helpful, both personally and in how we engaged. So TNC, like other organizations or individuals in the process, we were one voice throughout the process. And the use of the sighting tool showed really the diversity of perspectives that were weighed within the sighting of offshore wind. So this figure shows the conceptual approach for identifying where offshore wind could be developed. So it starts in the Gulf of Maine. BOEM started the siting process at a voluntary stage, which is this planning area stage. And then the site suitability model or the decision support model. So what I just talked about on the last slide, that was used to incorporate feedback at each steps of these processes. And over time, at each phase of the process, the agency, BOEM, continued to incorporate feedback and input from other agencies, the states, tribal governments, and all the stakeholders that were participating. And over time, it slowly winnowed down to a smaller area, including the lease areas that we saw at the end of October. So in practice, this is what that conceptual process looks like. At each step of the process, with more information incorporated, like I said, the area was winnowed down at each phase. And this was really a years-long process that many people engaged in over that time. And it also meant that some folks needed to take time away from their jobs to be able to participate in this really long and technical process. So for us, as we continue to participate, we became more and more focused on prioritizing what to put our attention to. We focused in on sensitive and vulnerable seafloor habitats because deep sea corals are a highly vulnerable species. They're also habitat forming and they support species diversity and abundance. However, there are limited visual observations of deep sea corals in the Gulf of Maine. And because of that, we realized the need to use proxies to understand where deep sea corals or other vulnerable benthic habitats could be. And we were not the only ones to identify this need. We quickly realized there were several competing recommendations that were seeking similar outcomes for coral protection. And from our view, the modeling process was complicated enough, and having multiple perspectives on how to approach avoiding deep sea corals kind of increased that complexity for decision makers. So we ended up prioritizing connecting with our partners in the region who were making similar recommendations to find better alignment on the recommendations that all of us were making on deep sea coral protection and approaches to navigating the data gaps for these habitats. We were also having really useful conversations with the deciding agency and their modeling team to help contextualize and inform the assumptions that were being made about the data. And that was also a really useful learning opportunity from the BOEM team as well. And we were not the only ones getting to have these conversations one-on-one with the agency. There were several members of the fishing industry and other organizations that were having similar types of conversations with BOEM that were either in small group settings or one-on-one. And these conversations seemed really useful in informing the agency and where offshore wind was eventually sited for development here in the Gulf of Maine. So the modeling process was not the only place that we engaged. So for those of you that were participating in this process, this figure is familiar to you. And I think that it's useful in that it identifies where stakeholders and the public can engage within the process. So we were able to look to our colleagues in Southern New England and the Mid-Atlantic that had been working on offshore wind for much longer than we had. And they were able to provide some really useful recommendations and how to focus in on our comments as well. So for instance, we weighed in on the development of the leasing conditions that were clarified before the lease auction. And these lease agreements bind developers to specific actions or activities as part of their lease. So if they are awarded it, these are the things that they will be held to do. So in the proposed sale notice, there were approximately 15 commenters out of the 269 that discussed concerns around benthic resources. So what we saw in the final sale notice, so what developers are agreeing to when they lease an area in the Gulf of Maine, was this inclusion of avoiding and minimizing impacts to sensitive seafloor habitats. And this is something that we hadn't seen required in other leases in Southern New England, the Mid-Atlantic, or California. So as I was reflecting on the siting process over the past few years, I think there were a few things that are worth replicating in other public processes, and there are some lessons learned as well. So first, I want to acknowledge that it is challenging to participate in a years-long public process, especially for folks that need to take time away from their jobs to participate. These processes were technical. Many of us, including myself, needed to get up to speed on the knowledge and information needed in order to meaningfully participate. From what I saw, creating flexibility in how people participate and engage was really important. There were several different types of opportunities to provide input that were created throughout the process, and it seemed like the team was learning as time went on for how to create those opportunities. I think that the notable thing about these opportunities was that making the decision makers making themselves available to individuals or small groups, meeting people in person or virtually, and I even heard stories of meeting in people's homes to have these conversations. So the other lesson learned or takeaway here is that it's really important to make sure people feel heard. I think this is something that we all know instinctually, but these small group meetings seem to create the spaces necessary for more nuanced conversations that were really potentially helpful for the final decision. Having dug into the public comments throughout the process, I can see in the final decisions in the lease areas a diversity of views and opinions that were included. So when I look at the final wind energy area, I can see recommendations from fisheries organizations, from conservation organizations, and other agencies that are reflected in that decision. And I think the lesson that I'm carrying with me into other parts of my work is figuring out where and how to participate in decision-making processes. So for our next audience question, I think it would be really helpful to understand what keeps us from engaging in public processes. This one is a word cloud, so you can type in one or two words to respond to this. And hopefully this will be helpful to our discussion. Time, yes. Yeah, those are both very real barriers. Time and knowing when meetings happen. They can be very inaccessible. It takes focus and energy. Things are moving very fast. Those emojis are so great. Feeling like there's a lack, there's a lack of knowledge, expertise, fear of not being heard. Politics, right? Not knowing what to care about. Also travel. Yeah. Well, these are great. Thank you. I'll let this go for just a little bit. So I think understanding these roadblocks as we move into this next section on potential ways to incorporate information in decision making will be helpful to keep in mind in order to have our next discussion. Awesome. Thank you for sharing, everybody. I really appreciate that. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next section as things are slowing down. So next I want to talk about some work that I'm doing right now on identifying on-ramps for climate ecosystem data and information, as well as local knowledge in fisheries management in New England. And it's not just identifying the on-ramps, but it's also knowing what to do in those places. So for a little background, as many folks here today know, the Gulf of Maine and the Northwest Atlantic is warming 2 to 3 times faster than the global average. So this graph here of sea surface temperature anomalies over the past 5 decades highlights that the Gulf of Maine is experiencing persistent warm anomalies since 2008, shown here on the right side of the graph. At the same time, 48% of commercially important stocks managed by the New England Fisheries Management Council are overfished. So that's 12 out of the 25. And in 2023, based on the status of stocks report, New England accounted for over a quarter or 27% of the nation's overfished stocks. So there are some species that are also more vulnerable to climate change, and it is negatively impacting many of the species' biological processes, including available habitat and food, as well as growth and reproduction and other metabolic functions. And this figure here from John Hare shows the species here in the Northeast that are particularly vulnerable to climate change. So in 2020, some colleagues and I conducted a survey to evaluate commercial fish harvesters' perceptions of the impacts of climate change on themselves, the ecosystem, and their communities. We had 418 survey respondents, of which approximately 50% were from Maine, 40% were from Massachusetts, and 3% were from New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and then 1% came from New York and New Jersey. So in this survey, respondents respondents overwhelmingly wanted to see climate change considered in fisheries management and did not think that management could adapt or respond quickly enough to changing environmental conditions. The survey also highlighted that the current management system is constraining the ability of harvesters to adapt to changing conditions. Respondents didn't feel that fisheries were managed in an equitable way, and respondents also did not feel as if they had a voice in the fisheries management process. So some of these are sounding somewhat similar to the responses that folks gave on the survey. So for those of you that are not steeped in federal fisheries management, the Magnuson-Stevens Act is the piece of legislation that guides federal fishing and federal fisheries management. It created 8 regional fisheries management councils with the goal of integrating public participation into the management process. So the councils are comprised of voting and non-voting members that represent commercial and recreational fishing sectors, environmental, academic, and government interests. And the council has several advisory bodies, including a scientific and statistical committee, as well as advisory panels that all provide a diversity of input and perspectives onto decision making. So the reality is that the council process can be really complicated to navigate and has very technical aspects to the process. So here I have mapped out a general overview of what the council process looks like. And so here on the left, we see a need for a significant amount of data and information to come into decision making. Here in the middle are the pathways for several different types of decisions that the regional council makes. So for instance, here at the top, right here, this is the harvest specification process that identifies how many fish can be sustainably caught each year. This middle and bottom, the middle and bottom processes are the pathways for other types of management measures or changes to fisheries management plans. And then all of this goes to the council where they make their management recommendations that get sent to NOAA Fisheries for rulemaking. So by mapping out this process, we can start to identify where and how climate and ecosystem information and place-based knowledge or local knowledge can be incorporated into the management process. So I wanted to demonstrate what this looks like. For instance, to assess if climate change is adequately considered in deciding how many fish can be caught for any given species, we can assess each step along the way. So first, are the surveys adequately capturing changes in species distribution or habitat? Next, are there mechanistic links between species and abundance and environmental factors that can be incorporated into the stock assessment? If there's not a clear relationship between species and abundance and environmental variables, is there a way to adjust harvest levels based on ecosystem indicators? And then finally, councils have risk policies in place to make decisions that consider scientific uncertainty. And some councils, like New England, who's updated their risk policy, now have incorporated climate change and other types of information when deciding how precautionary they should be in decision making. So ideally, at least in this example, decision makers will have had enough information in hand to adequately consider climate and ecosystem impacts to a species while they are deciding how many fish can be caught. By having enough information to carefully consider the external factors, managers would ideally be able to make decisions with more certainty. So there are additional opportunities for consideration in how climate and ecosystem can come into this decision-making process. But what feels really important, really challenging right now is understanding how and where to incorporate local knowledge more thoughtfully throughout the decision-making process. So there are opportunities for public comment at each stage, but anecdotally, it seems like engagement in the process is less than what it used to be in the past. And then we all just identified several barriers to participating in this process as well. So I think that there are specific questions that we need to be asking ourselves and how to bring in local knowledge. At the data stage, we can ask our fisheries independent data collected through a collaborative survey that's designed in partnerships with harvesters. And are these data that they trust? For the stock assessments, we can ask if harvesters or other key parties were consulted for some of the assumptions that are made within stock assessments. Under the management measures, we can ask if harvesters' knowledge can be used to assess how static or dynamic management measures respond under changing ocean conditions. And finally, the councils have policies that really influence their decision making and guides it. And so it's worth asking if councils are utilizing a framework to evaluate how impacts are being distributed across user groups. So for our final survey, I'm wondering if folks in this room, let me get the QR code open. It would be great to hear what ideas for overcoming barriers to participation folks in the audience might have. Childcare is super important. I like this idea of low stakes commitment. I would love to hear more about what that looks like. That relationship building one is super critical as well. Citizen small group, also a really interesting idea. Love to hear more about that. Flexibility, yeah. More ways to participate. Science communication. Be clear about what is needed. Yeah, I think that is a great point. These words are so small on my screen, I'm having to squint to see them. This is really amazing though. Convenient meeting places, concentrated demands, inclusion, reciprocity, awesome. All right, welcoming spaces. These are great, thank you. So in the interest of time, I will move on. It looks like the responses have slowed down. So just to wrap things up, before we move on to a discussion, I just want to provide a few concluding statements and give you the questions that I gave some of the students earlier today. So in reality, my big two takeaways are pretty simple, and that is the need for a range of views to be a part of natural resources management. Sustainable outcomes really require so many perspectives throughout the decision-making process, and it really makes just for much better outcomes. And that partnership and collaboration amongst stakeholders can really help bring clarity to what those desired outcomes are. And I think that was a pretty big lesson learned for me throughout the offshore wind siting process. I would love to hear others' takeaways from today's talk. Overall, I think this is sort of fundamentally what I landed on. So I'm hoping that we can have a chance to dig into some really meaty questions. I'm also happy to answer any questions that folks have. But the three questions I proposed to Dr. Leslie's lab, as well as the EES seminar class, was this first one. So from your experiences, what are successful ways to overcoming barriers to participation in natural resource management processes? Do you have examples for how climate, ecosystem information, or local knowledge are being incorporated into fisheries or natural resource management? Really, that exemplify a successful approach. And then I think one of the ones that I've been really struggling with is what do you think successful incorporation of climate and ecosystem information and local knowledge looks like? What does success look like for incorporation of these ideas into the management process? So thank you all for your time and attention today. Please feel free to reach out for any follow-up ideas or questions or conversations you would like to have. My email address is right here. And with that, I will turn it over to the moderator.